The Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties, and their potential for protecting Arctic resources and cultures. In this lecture, does the United States really benefit from ratification of UNCLOS? Stephen Groves asks, does the U.S. cede international authority by remaining a non-party to UNCLOS? Can the U.S. imply the existence of international law to guide the U.S. in its efforts to claim waters and submerged land not within the economic zones adjacent to U.S. territory? Groves is Director for Policy Campaigns for the Heritage Foundation.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'd like to thank the Juneau World Affairs Forum for inviting me to attend. I apologize, of course, for not being able to attend in person as much as I would have loved to have seen Alaska for the first time and Juneau. I've got a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old who are running around downstairs. Inevitably, they'll make some type of audible appearance during the presentation. So I apologize in advance for that as well. But I greatly appreciate the invitation to come and talk with you today and talk about my favorite treaty, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and outline the reasons why, in my view, thus far, the U.S. has not ratified the treaty. Which, as a conservative working at the Heritage Foundation, we see as a good thing. I intend to keep my remarks fairly brief so that we can get to Q&A. I always find that the Q&A is the more interesting and engaging part of presentations and groups like these. So. I just wanted to thank you guys again. And, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, has been around for a very long time. It was first signed when I was either in 6th or 7th grade. It came into force as a treaty when I was in law school and has been up for consideration by the Senate on multiple occasions, most recently in 2012. So it's been a long time since the treaty's even been under consideration by the Senate. I testified at the 2012 hearings, which were chaired at the time by then Senator John Kerry. And I think they held about 4 hearings over the course of a couple of weeks and called, probably 30 or 40 witnesses. I was one of 2 witnesses who testified against ratification. And the reasons why I testified against ratification, there are several major ones, and we can dive into some of the minor ones or into the intricacies of these reasons during Q&A, but allow me to kind of outline them in brief for you. As a rule of thumb, the United States, should not join any treaty that does not materially advance U.S. national interests, materially and tangibly advance them. There must be, in my view, a specific benefit that is gained by joining the treaty, and that benefit or benefits cannot be outweighed by any of the detriments that comes with the treaty. In a treaty, you're always kind of giving and taking, but in order for a treaty to really advance U.S. national interests, in my view, the pluses should greatly outweigh the minuses. We should be really being able to advance our interests by joining the treaty. This is true of all treaties, arms control, environmental, trade treaties. You don't want to be part of something where you are not gaining more than you're losing. And with that approach, I did a detailed analysis of the treaty and testified in 2012, and the treaty was ultimately defeated. Senator Kerry never even brought it to a vote at the Foreign Relations Committee. And the reasons I outlined, I'm going to give you a few. The first one is called Article 82. And Article 82 requires countries that are parties to the treaty to share royalty revenue income from oil and gas development on the extended continental shelf with the rest of the world. Being Alaska, there are probably several people in the room who understand how offshore oil and gas development work, and that royalties are paid to the Treasury by any companies that are doing that type of exploration. Now, if you join the treaty and you engage in oil and gas exploration on the extended continental shelf, which is the U.S. continental shelf beyond 200 nautical meters, not nautical miles, excuse me, then you also have to send royalties to the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, where they will be distributed according to some formula to be announced. So that's strike one for me, because if U.S. companies are engaged in oil exploration on U.S. extended continental shelf, in my view, 100% of any royalties should be going to the Treasury for the benefit of the American people and not distributed around the world for reasons that have yet to be fully developed. So that's strike one, Article 82. The second reason is if you join the treaty as a nation, you expose yourself to international lawsuits. There have been some high-profile international lawsuits that have already gone through the system. And if you lose in one of these international forums, either at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea or in an international arbitral tribunal, those judgments are enforceable domestically here in the United States. And so the problem with that is that any other country that's a party to the law of the sea can then sue the U.S. tied up in litigation and cause great economic harm. And the main hypothetical that I raise is that a law of the sea country could sue the United States, for example, for climate change, pollution of the marine environment through carbon emissions. That used to be a somewhat fanciful idea, but in the years since 2012, in fact, multiple international tribunals have generated advisory opinions stating that nations are in fact liable to the rest of the world for carbon emissions. And one of those tribunals that did so was the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. I think the International Court of Justice is also getting involved, as well as the Inter-American courts. So the international tribunals that are out there are already inclined to require states to be responsible for carbon emissions and financially responsible to any other countries that are damaged by carbon emissions. And the U.S. would be the main culprit due to its historical carbon emissions over time. So that's strike two, exposure to baseless international lawsuits that would require, if enforced in the United States, massive payments and transfers of wealth to other countries. So the third item has to deal with deep seabed mining. So if you join the treaty and you want to engage in deep seabed mining, you have to go to the International Seabed Authority for permission to do so. And if anyone's been tracking the International Seabed Authority over the last decade or so, they have been entirely inept. And I think corrupt and completely compromised in their so-called efforts to generate regulations on seabed mining that would actually allow seabed mining to happen for manganese nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So, if the United States decides that mining seabed minerals is an important interest uh, for national security, for the economy. The last thing, in my view, that I think the United States should have to do is go ask permission from an international organization to engage in those mining activities, and then also be subject to their regulations, environmental and otherwise, and really have operations that are at the whim of an international organization. That's a transfer of authority and a transfer of sovereignty that I'm just not, in my view, just not comfortable with. I don't think that if something is so important that the U.S. is going to, expend resources to go and get seabed minerals, that we need to be doing it um, only at the behest, only at the permission of an international organization like the International Seabed Authority, which, as I've mentioned, is an imperfect organization to be sure. So those are kind of my three strikes on why we shouldn't join the treaty. But more broadly, in addition to, you only join treaties that advance your national interests, you also only join treaties if they're absolutely necessary to do so. So if joining the Law of the Sea Treaty was absolutely necessary for the U.S. to advance its maritime interests, then I doubt that I or anyone else at the Heritage Foundation would have a problem with joining. But there's been no evidence that joining this treaty is necessary to advance those interests. No evidence at all. In fact, the U.S. Navy just celebrated, I think, their 250th anniversary. And so we've been operating a U.S. Navy for, 200 years before the Law of the Sea Treaty was even invented. And as I mentioned, it was signed in 82, came into force in 94, and somehow the U.S. Navy manages to advance its global mission, apace, without running into any issues with the Law of the Sea Treaty. And in fact, I've had many conversations with naval officers up to and including the Chief of Naval Operations, and I've asked, if we join the treaty, and they're all in favor of joining the treaty, and I asked them, if you join the treaty, what would you do differently? How would you operate differently in the South China Sea? Would you, transit the Strait of Hormuz in a different way? And of course, the answer is no, because the U.S. Navy is going to go out and execute its mission regardless of whether the U.S. is party to this treaty or any other. That's kind of the benefit of having a powerful U.S. Navy with 11 carrier groups. So simply put, joining the treaty isn't necessary. We can develop the oil and gas on our continental shelf without joining the treaty and without having to pay those royalties. We can execute our global mission as a naval power without joining the treaty. And if we stay outside the treaty, we won't be subject to international lawsuits. We won't have to pay those Article 2 royalties. And just on balance, if you analyze the treaty in that way, and you accept the premise that you have to weigh the pros and the cons of joining the treaty, I don't think there's much of a case for joining it. I think the cons greatly outweigh any pros, and the pros that are out there are kind of gauzy. They don't seem to be very concrete to me, very rhetorical. And I've yet to be convinced otherwise, but perhaps there's someone in the room today that can convince me otherwise. But I do appreciate being invited to attend. I might be one of the only kind of treaty skeptics that you'll hear from in the forum this year, but I'm happy to play that role for the group and answer any questions that you have and dive deeper into any of the issues that I've raised, or feel free to discuss any other issues that I haven't raised. So with that, I think 10 minutes in, I think I've rambled for long enough, and I'm happy to do some Q&A with the group. Thanks again for allowing me to appear today.
I guess I'll start. You mentioned Article 2 royalties. I mean, we're here in Alaska, we're quite familiar with oil royalties and all this goes. Is there a schedule of what those royalties are?
No. Yes. There's a sliding schedule that after a certain, they understand that you have to allow the company to get out there and start, doing production and start recouping some of their costs of engaging in the activity itself. And I believe it's in year 6. After 5 years of production, in year 6, the company is to pay. Well, it's not the company. I mean, the company pays them to the Treasury, and the Treasury pays them to the International Seabed Authority. So I think it's in year 6, you pay a 1% royalty. In year 7, 2%. In year 8, 3%, up to a 7% royalty. And then for as many years as you produce after then, you pay the 7% royalty. So these would be in addition to the royalties that are already paid by the oil company. But yes, there is a schedule set forth in the treaty.
Looking at the high seas and imagining developments on the seabed, how does one resolve competing claims of states for development of a singular resource area nodule?
Right. It's one of the tougher questions, and we're actually going to find that out because at least one U.S. company called the Metals Company has applied to engage in seabed mining in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in an area where they have a relationship with a small island state called Nauru, and they've got another country, Tonga, that they're working with. The short answer is that under customary international law of the high seas, a country is permitted to engage in high seas freedoms, like deep seabed mining, so long as you do not interfere with the exercise of another country's high seas freedoms. So we see this play out in regard to other high seas freedoms, like the freedom of fishing and to lay undersea cables and stuff like that. Deep seabed mining is just another one of those high seas freedoms. So as long as the U.S. and its companies are in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone and they are not mining in an area that has been claimed or is being mined by another country, then they are meeting their obligations under customary international law. So that's the short answer, is you don't interfere in someone else's high seas freedoms and they don't interfere in ours. And you negotiate these things out ahead of time, which I believe is what's going on with the Metals Company and the countries that have claims down in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone.
Hello. If you were asked today by the president, say tomorrow, to suggest amendments to the law of the sea, what would you that would make it worthwhile for the United States to enter? What would those be? And let me just ask a second question while I'm here, and that is, how would you do your pluses and minuses evaluation for Alaska alone, just to show you that we can come up with an Alaska-centric question?
Of course. You know, we've kicked these ideas around for quite a while. you know, at the Heritage Foundation, we don't lightly say no to the U.S. Navy when they come to us, and they have come to us over the years and said, hey, Heritage, you guys have lots of influence on the Hill. We can't get through this treaty unless, you either get behind it or step aside. And the Navy tells us we need this treaty for our global mission. So that was kind of my starting point when I first started analyzing the treaty is, hey, should we really be against this? The Navy says they need it, very badly, and they've always said so. We've always kicked around the idea of not amending the treaty, which would be very, very difficult to do a second time. They did it back in 1994 to try to fix some of the deep seabed mining provisions. But we tried to think about how we could do it through reservations, understandings, and declarations in our instrument of ratification. And the amendments that we would need are just they're too much to be accepted by the other countries because they would be amendments. If I could wave my magic wand here, is to get rid of Article 82. If countries are going to go to the expense and risk of oil exploration on the extended continental shelf, they get all of the royalties. Those royalties belong to the United States because they are on the U.S. continental shelf, whether it's extended or not. So Amendment 1 would be to get rid of Article 82. Amendment 2 would be, you could keep the dispute resolution mechanisms in there, but make them voluntary. That make it so that the jurisdiction is not mandatory. Right now, if you're a party to the treaty and another country sues you for climate change or for some other environmental allegation, you are compelled by the terms of the treaty to appear and to defend yourself and to enforce whatever ruling the International Tribunal hands down. So amendment number 2 would be to make the dispute resolution mechanisms voluntary instead of mandatory. And then I think the final item would be to really water the International Seabed Authority pretty much out of existence. Seabed mining, we're getting closer and closer to the day that actual seabed mining is going to happen in the deep seabed. Leave it to the countries to negotiate the terms of those mining areas themselves. There could even be, a multinational council like the Arctic Council that is much more relevant to Alaska than this treaty, and just get the ISA out of the business of deep seabed mining, and let the countries themselves negotiate amongst themselves and figure out what the environmental standards should be, figure out if there should be any royalty sharing. Other countries that have skin in the game, countries that can actually engage in deep seabed mining, and get rid of this entire scheme of giving royalties over to an international organization to distribute to poor countries and landlocked countries and I guess to whomever else they see fit. Unfortunately, those are such significant amendments to the treaty that they would never be allowed. I would think that my recommendation, if President Trump were to reach out, and this would be a very interesting phone call if I had received it from the president. My advice would be to start over. UNCLOS was not the first law of the sea treaty; it was the third. There was UNCLOS 1, there was UNCLOS 2, which produced law of the sea treaties by which actually that the U.S. ratified. And then they put UNCLOS 3 together, and they came out with this treaty here. So the advice would be to start over and reconvene the states parties and develop an UNCLOS 4 that better reflects where the world is in 2025, start from scratch, and and see what happens. You know, the UNCLOS 3 was negotiated in a different time and place in the middle of a Cold War, uh, where notions of, you know, the common heritage of mankind and uh, similar kind of gauzy, soft-headed ideas were de rigueur. Um, you know, the world has changed, and times have changed, and geopolitics have changed, and maybe it's time to take a harder look at UNCLOS 3 and start a new conference to start from scratch. Relating to Alaska, you know, there's nothing in the treaty that benefits Alaska. If the U.S. joined the treaty, nothing would change for Alaska or its inhabitants or its businesses. We have the requisite uh, statutes on the books relating to oil and gas exploration, for example. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act comes to mind. Um, we have delineated our not only our maritime borders uh, in that relate to Alaska. You know, we did it with the Soviets during the Cold War uh, in a treaty involving the Bering Strait, where the maritime boundary was drawn. We have a maritime boundary with our close ally Canada. There's one minor maritime dispute that the U.S. and Canada haven't sorted out yet on drawing a line, but I'm sure that can be figured out. And then we've recently completed mapping the extended continental shelf relating to the submerged continental shelf off of Alaska. So all of the information, statutes, and regulations are in place relating to all of Alaska's interests. Unless feel free to tell me if there's something that Alaska needs from this treaty that it doesn't currently have, and I'd be happy to hear that and comment on it. But just like the rest of the country, Alaska doesn't gain anything if the U.S. joins the treaty. Joining the treaty isn't necessary in any way for Alaska to advance its interests as a state. Um, but you know, I'm happy to discuss that with folks in the room who will have definitely more of a detailed perspective on Alaska and its needs than I do, sitting here in Montgomery, Alabama. But happy to talk more about Alaska.
Just throwing out a slightly different perspective, you have captains of large tanker vessels traveling internationally from all sorts of nations. The one thing that I'm trying to think of the abbreviation, but the convention brings is a common understanding of innocent passage in some of those zones. So I'm just kind of curious how you would reflect on that from your perspective.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd answer I've got two answers for you. One is that, you know, there's very little in the treaty that controls commercial, civilian maritime traffic. There are a series of other international agreements and treaties that the U.S. is party to and has been party to from the beginning that regulate, you know, commercial traffic and the pollution of commercial vessels and flags of convenience and trade and ports and safety at sea. You know, there's a constellation of maritime treaties out there that the civilian and commercial world follows. That's what they follow, and that's why they've been able to do that without, the U.S. or some other countries being a party to the treaty. Um, you mentioned innocent passage, and innocent passage relates only to military vessels. Um, Innocent passage means involves if you are a military vessel like a carrier or destroyer or a submarine, and you are getting within 12 nautical miles of another country's shoreline. Um, you have to, under the terms of the treaty, engage in innocent passage, which means if you're going to pass through somebody's territorial sea, you have to do so in such a way that you're not engaging in aggressive military exercises or some type of show of force. That has to be done outside of 12 nautical miles from the shore. So there's no application of the doctrine of innocent passage to commercial vessels or oil tankers, only military vessels.
My name's Betsy Baker. I'm one of the panelists who will be speaking next on the continental shelf. And I'm really, truly sorry you're not here. It would be really fun to engage in more of these conversations. There's a long line of people behind me also wanting to ask questions.
Right.
So you've generated a lot of interest. We are entering a new era of multilateral and international relations. And so it is necessary, and the one thing I do admire about the Heritage Foundation is that you do think about these things, and you look long term. I'm going to propose an idea and then just ask you to think about what the new system will look like. But would one way to accomplish some of your questions, your concerns, for example, with the Seabed Authority, wouldn't we be able better to influence it if we were party and therefore guaranteed a seat on the council? We'll hear from other panelists today about the incredibly effective campaign of China to control and create new coalitions within the Seabed Authority on the financial mechanisms, for example. I guess I'll leave my question there, just a simple question that you could apply more broadly to other multilateral organizations. Why is it not in our great interest? Why is it not more benefit than the cost to participate and exercise our considerable strength as one of the leading naval powers and one of the strongest economies in the world? Thanks for your remarks. You've generated a lot of reaction.
I'm glad to hear that, Betsy. Betsy is my daughter's name. Are you an Elizabeth or are you just Betsy? My daughter's an Elizabeth, but we call her Betsy. Um, you know, uh, we do go back and forth about if we joined and were so, at that table, we had a seat at the table, we had our council seat. Could we influence things so greatly that it became in the interests of the U.S. to be in the treaty? Are the potential cons of joining the treaty, could we make them go away if we were inside the treaty and inside the room and countering China? My answer to that has to end up being no, mainly, Betsy, because the types of changes, in my view, that would be required to make the treaty in U.S. interests are not going to be resolved if the U.S. joins it and is on the council. The council has certain powers, but the council, isn't going to nullify Article 82 and get rid of international royalties, nor is the council going to make, dispute resolution voluntary versus mandatory. There are just certain things the council can do and things the council can't do. Moreover, while I would agree that the U.S. would have, more influence than most down in Kingston, it certainly wouldn't have, some type of massive, authority down there. It would be it would be one more major country that's in the mix. Um, and it would be the U.S. interest that we would pursue down there. Take, for example, finishing the mining code. You know, a lot of the countries down there, that are in Kingston, they don't want to finish the mining code. They pretend they want to finish the mining code. They make a lot of noise about it if they could only just get that environmental study figured out. But let's face it, um, a lot of the ISA is deeply compromised, not just by the Chinese Communist Party, but by radical environmental groups who have way more influence, say, in that international organization than they should or was ever intended when the US and other countries negotiated UNCLOS back in the day. So I think that your question presumes that if the US showed up on the scene down in Kingston, that there would be uh, some ability to change things in a major way. Yes, it would be able to serve as a counterweight to China. That I won't disagree with. Um, but I don't know if that alone is sufficient to say, yes, we should ratify the treaty because of its significant flaws that could not be reversed by the Council. I hope that answers your question, Betsy, but
It's a starting point, and it's too bad you're not here. We could continue this over dinner. I will say I'm not sure that the promises of the convention seem gauzy to the small states that would receive some of the benefits from the royalties, for example. For the United States, perhaps more gauzy, but there are some concrete benefits. I will let others ask more questions, but thank you, and come up. We'd love to have you up here.
thank you so much, Betsy. And I would just say that, of course, there's almost 200 countries in the world. Um, some of them will benefit greatly by joining this treaty, particularly if royalties start getting generated and distributed. And if I were in a think tank in one of those countries, I would be very enthusiastic about joining the treaty for those reasons. But those same benefits don't really inure to the United States. We would be the one paying the royalties, not the one receiving them. So it's broadly, just like any other treaty, every country must make its own analysis of whether a treaty advances its national interests or not. The conclusion, as a heritage policy wonk that I've had so far, is that it doesn't advance U.S. interests such that ratification should be supported. Thanks for your question, Betsy.
Hi, thanks for your remarks. I feel like you've kind of already addressed my question in some ways with the last question asked, but I'll go ahead and put it out there anyway. Earlier you had talked about freedoms on the high seas under customary international law and around the area. And I guess I'm just curious how you would juxtapose your thoughts on deep seabed mining with freedom of the high seas with other high seas freedoms, I guess you might call them, that the United States has signed treaties. For example, the 1995 fish stocks agreement that we are under. The U.S. is on most, if not all, the RFMOs established on that, and we're very much a part of that, which is under the umbrella of UNCLOS. So, just kind of juxtaposing those two positions, I'm curious your thoughts.
Sure, it gets complex fast, and fisheries treaties. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the first, maybe it's the only law of the sea treaty that the U.S. isn't a party to. The U.S. as a major maritime power has always been at the forefront of negotiating maritime treaties. Whether they were the ones that were generated out of UNCLOS 1 on the high seas and the continental shelf, or on fisheries, and other the other treaties that I've mentioned, like MARPOL, and the treaties regarding the saving life at sea. We are as a nation, heavily engaged on maritime issues, both commercially, with civilians and militarily. So you have to approach each of these treaties separately. And when it advanced U.S. interest to join a treaty, whether it's a maritime boundary treaty with Mexico in the Gulf of America, uh, or with the USSR in the Bering Strait, or even with Cuba, we have a treaty with them. I don't know that we've ratified it yet on the maritime boundary with them. So the subject matter of each treaty, determines whether it advances U.S. interests, not whether it overlaps with this kind of framework convention that we haven't ratified yet. It might be considered one of the flaws of the treaty is that they almost tried to do too much during the negotiation. If they would have just kept all of the navigational rights and freedoms, the transit of international straits, archipelagic waters, high seas freedoms, and all of the kind of the core issues relating to the high seas and the fisheries treaties that are born from these principles. I think the U.S. would have ratified this treaty back in the Reagan administration. The problem was that and I think it was during the Nixon administration, they cut this deal with the developing world where they wanted to tack on all of these other economic issues relating to seabed mining, related to the Article 82 royalties, and it just, pardon the pun, kind of muddied the waters and made what could have been a clean, treaty that was trying to fix some of the problems of the prior treaties and set maritime boundaries, set the limits of the exclusive economic zone, and make those uniform. If they would have just stuck to their knitting and done those things, then I wouldn't be having this discussion because this would have been ratified while I was in middle school.
All right, we'll switch it around a little bit. So just about 2 years ago, the Department of State issued its claim for extended outer continental shelf. About half of that, or slightly more than half, is Alaska. So that's kind of an interest to us. As you noted, most of the maritime boundaries that would come out of that, there's the issue with Canada over by Barter Island that would go out. There's also the issue with Russia out in the Aleutians, where that maritime boundary is not resolved yet either. Given that we cannot, as long as we're not a member of UNCLOS, we can't basically patent our claim to the extended continental shelf. What mechanisms might we have to enforce any U.S. jurisdiction in those areas?
Sure. There's a couple of answers to it. I don't want to give the blunt one first. The blunt one is that we have a U.S. Navy that can enforce our claims, including our claims against the Russians. But I don't think things like that would have to come to that. Nations like the U.S. and Russia and Canada, we're going to act on our own interests and negotiate maritime boundaries. Negotiation of maritime boundaries have been going on for centuries. It will continue to go on regardless of whether the U.S. is party to this or any other treaty. So the extended continental shelf is such an interesting and fascinating topic, especially for you Alaskans, because there's so much of it up there. I'm of the view that the U.S. should submit its findings, all that bathymetric data and stuff to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which is a commission established by UNCLOS, who is there to look and review claims to extended continental shelf. And if no one objects to those claims, kind of rubber stamping them and saying, okay, this is where your extended continental shelf ends and where the deep seabed begins. Someone in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that there is no provision of the treaty that prevents a non-party like the United States from submitting a claim to the CLCS. Yes, another country could object, but that happens quite a bit, and the CLCS isn't empowered under the treaty to resolve any such objections or disputes between parties. So even if we were a party to the treaty and submitted our findings on the ECS to the CLCS, other countries like Russia could object anyway. And I think even though we didn't submit it to the CLCS, Russia objected to our findings anyway. I guess just to be on the record that they objected to our findings. But joining the treaty isn't going to magically make those disputes go away. They will have to be resolved bilaterally, as other maritime disputes are resolved. But if I don't think it'll come to it. But if push comes to shove, we have other diplomatic and other economic and, if necessary, military options. But I don't think that's really on the table. These are maritime disputes, and we resolve them. The main one dealing with Alaska, the line going through the Bering Strait, was resolved at the height of the Cold War, or during, at least during the Cold War. So if we were able to negotiate maritime boundaries with Khrushchev and whoever was in charge back then, I think we can negotiate maritime boundaries with Putin or any of that crowd in the Kremlin.
Stephen, first of all, Betsy wanted just to confirm your understanding of the ability of the U.S., although it's not a signatory to the treaty, to be able to submit disputes. She confirms that.
That what?
Again, the U.S. would... Nothing bars the U.S. from submitting a claim.
Great.
My question for you is this, and it gets back to the International Seabed Authority. You've described your concern about its corruption, among other things, but its overall framework. I'd like to get, I suspect I know the answer, but the philosophy underlying it was, I think, the idea that high seabed resources are a common part
Common
of the
heritage.
common
Heritage.
good of humanity.
Mm.
And as a consequence, every nation should have some claim to the resources as exploited. However, the nations that are able to best exploit it are the richest nations, the most powerful, which seems to be a reversion to an older pattern, which is simply the strongest prevail. Do you see any formulation that would allow for the sharing of royalties, for example, or the exploitation of deep seabed resources?
I don't think so. I think that their hearts were in the right place when they negotiated those provisions, but they are provisions that are fairly unique. Again, I open it up to the group to say I'm wrong, but a woman earlier raised fisheries agreements that we get into. The U.S. gets into fisheries agreements, but they don't agree to transfer either a portion of the fish or the profits from the acquiring those fish to poor countries or to landlocked countries or anyone else. I'm aware of no other international agreement where um, you know the engaging in very difficult commercial activity should somehow the benefits of that and the profits from that should not be enjoyed by the people that risk the capital, risk their lives sometimes when they're engaged in these fishing activities with other countries. So uh, I think that this idea of the common heritage of mankind, uh, as I mentioned, was just part of uh, part of what people were thinking about back in the 60s and 70s, and they they applied it to this treaty with a royalty sharing scheme uh, that just doesn't sit well with American conservatives, at least. If it was okay, this would have passed the Senate uh, a long time ago. Um, but it may seem unfair that you know that small countries that don't have the capabilities to engage in deep seabed mining, uh, I don't think that is unfair. I don't make an apology for countries that have the technological capabilities, take the risk, spend the capital, and are able to dredge up, manganese nodules from the bottom of the ocean and then ship them to refineries in different places around the world, ri risk their capital, risk their investment, only to then turn around and say, you know what, some of the profits that you just made, you've got to send it, to the Democratic Republic of Congo, or you've got to send it to Cambodia. Um, that doesn't seem fair to me. So I don't know, as much as we stretch our imaginations, how you could come up with a royalty scheme that would make any sense.
Yeah, thank you. Paul Foose here. So a provision that would be very important to Alaska is Section 234, the ability to provide coastal states to provide provisions in ice-covered waters that could actually help protect food security, which is the number one threat to our northern people up there because of their reliance on marine mammals. So we had a spill up there to be catastrophic. So if you could address that, that's one very important provision to us. The other thing is you say, well, we'll just go out there and mine and the strongest would prevail. I don't see how that works. If you're going to do that, the Chinese are the strongest to prevail right now at this moment. And there is such a thing as the tragedy of the commons, as we saw with the, destruction of cod resources or, the battles of the range early on in the U.S. I mean, these companies need some surety, at least on the leasing. So, otherwise it'll be a catastrophe out there.
Well, the good news on your second question is that we're going to find out, I think, pretty soon whether the treaty is necessary to do deep seabed mining. There is a company it's been in the news called the Metals Company, who has applied to mine the deep seabed under existing U.S. laws and regulations, the Deep Seabed Hard Mineral Resources Act. And so, it's when it come, I don't think when I said when it comes to the deep seabed mining that whoever's the most whoever's going to use force is the one that gets to do it. I think I was much more in the realm of countries should negotiate with one another and not infringe on each other's high seas freedoms. So if the U.S. wants to exercise its high seas freedoms to engage in seabed mining, it should do so so long as it's not infringing on the rights of another country. I'm not familiar, as your first question, I'm not familiar off the top of my head with Section 234, but it sounded like it was relating to environmental issues. As far as I understand, the U.S. certainly has enough environmental laws and regulations on its books to regulate, any incidents that are involved off of Alaska's North Shore. I don't know what Section 234 would require the U.S. to do differently. But thank you for your question.
That was Stephen Groves discussing, does the United States really benefit from ratification of UNCLOS? It was recorded October 10th, 2025 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit-Ani as part of the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties and their potential for protecting Arctic resources and cultures. Produced by the Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100 in collaboration with KTOO. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wastman & Associates, Ramada Inn,